so glad that we got Karl Marlantes here, and I thank you all for coming out, even though I realize the temperature's dropping and everybody starts freaking out again. And since we had to postpone, which was a shame, this just occurred to me, why did you not get on your skis and get your ass here?
It was a little far.
Just kidding.
I know.
But we're really glad that Karl could make it at all. He's a busy man, and partially we have his publisher, Grove Atlantic, to thank, because they're old pals, and we and Lemuria benefit from our their kindness and our old friendship with them. So
There you go.
Karl's mostly doing West Coast stuff, but we were lucky enough to get him here. And thanks to him for wanting to come. Karl, probably a lot of you already know a good bit about him and his writing. He grew up in Seaside, Oregon, where he was an outstanding student and an impressive jock, which amazed me. But anybody, maybe you could ask him questions about his jock history, but it's very unique, I think. He's still in Oregon. Are you still in Seaside?
No, it was Cannon Beach. Went about 5 miles south.
Oh, okay. So he's been hanging out there for quite a while. After Seaside and his jock history as an outstanding student, he went on to Yale, and there he trained in their Marine Corps program and was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, which took him to Oxford, the other Oxford. And he left Oxford after that to join active duty as an infantry officer and was sent to Vietnam. And for his service there, this is quite incredible, he was awarded a Bronze Star, 2 Navy medals for valor, 2 Purple Hearts, I didn't even know you could do that, and 10 Air Medals. So he had quite an exalted history there. And many of you probably read Matterhorn, his first novel, which 2010, is that right? Which draws on his experiences in Vietnam and to a certain extent to his return to civilian life. And that book, of course, received many awards, too numerous to mention, but I will say that Sebastian Junger said that Matterhorn was one of the most profound and devastating novels to come out of Vietnam or any war, which, if you know anything about Sebastian, that's high praise. And Matterhorn was followed in 2011 by a memoir, an extraordinary memoir, what it is like to go to war, about returning or trying to return to civilian world, and his problems, among many other things, with PTSD. His second novel, Deep River, in 2019, chronicles a Finnish family that flees Finland and resettles in a logging community in the Pacific Northwest, and examines the logging industry in the early 20th century, which is pretty fascinating, and with which Karl's family had some experiences. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. Just check. His new novel, this one that we're all here for this evening, Cold Victory, is set in Helsinki in 1947, where Louise and Arnie Koski arrive, and Arnie assumes his new position as military attaché with the American legation there in Helsinki. And his job is to gather intelligence and reestablish U.S. relations with Finland, which is now dominated at this point by the Soviet Union. Arnie reconnects with a close war friend, Natalya Bobrova, who has the same assignment for the Soviet Union, which was, of course, our ally in World War II, but now was becoming, at this point in 1947, something of an enemy, foreshadowing, of course, the Cold War to come. After a night of drinking, Mikhail and Arnie, stupidly somewhat, I guess, the two men decide to race each
Drunkenly.
other. Sorry?
Drunkenly.
Yeah, very drunkenly, the two old buddies decide to race each other in a 300-mile ski race in deep winter, which what ensues is an intense political situation and a serious threat to them and to their families. And reading this part about the race kind of makes our ice storm look like a week in Panama City. It's just really extraordinary. It's a great story and kept me up on several nights reading through it. So, any questions? I'm sure there'll be time for that, and Karl's okay about answering questions. And so please welcome Karl Marlantes.
Yes, and I also want to say something about Lisa that you may not know. She makes a very mean gumbo. Last night it's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about how this novel came about, and then read a passage or two, and then we'll just open it up to questions. And I answer everything, but maybe not always intelligently, but I answer it. This novel is the result of a couple things. I'll go into some detail. But one is a story that my uncle told me, and the other one was when the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014, and it sort of triggered it. My uncle, who was a fluent Finnish speaker, my family's half of my family's my mother's side, also from the 50s to the embassy then in Helsinki. It was only a legation because they were technically our enemies. They had sided with the Germans to try to get back their territory that the Russians took from them, and no one would help them. And therein is a cautionary tale. No one would help them, and so they lost. And even though most Finns feel like they won because they stood up to this behemoth so well, that in the end they were just crushed. And so he told me the story that he was in Helsinki in the mid-50s, and there was a Finnish military academy, young boys, probably 17, 18-year-olds, and every year they had an annual cross-country ski trek, and it is brutally cold there, and it's even in the 50s it was mostly just wilderness up in the north part of Finland. And he's a good skier, and he thought that would be interesting to go along with these guys and do it 300. The race was, I think, 300 kilometers. Of course, in the novel, I made it 500. So he decided that he would just accompany them and just go along. It would just sort of be just a trek, racing. But the Soviet embassy, as usually, they're very suspicious of everything, and so they assigned a young military officer, also a lieutenant colonel, the same rank, late 30s. They both in late 30s, and my uncle Dick knew him, and he said he's a good guy, but he wasn't particularly in really good shape. And so when they took off on this trek, and in those days, you could say in Finland you could say nothing against the Soviet Union, nothing. I mean, if you said a peep that was bad, I mean, the hammers would come down. I mean, the Red Army was on the borders. They had a Navy base 20 kilometers from Helsinki. They controlled virtually everything, and that's why what they call Finlandization, which the Finns hate to hear, but they were just very constrained. So how could they do anything? Guess what? The sports pages could start to spin this race of my uncles as a race between, freedom and democracy versus totalitarianism and communism, and it went into the sports pages as a race, and then it got picked up as a race by the Swedish papers and the Danish papers, and pretty soon, within a couple of days, it was in the New York papers, it was in the Los Angeles Times, it was in the London Times, then it got to Moscow, and my uncle was oblivious to this because they were out skiing in the wilderness, which is the same sort of plot. Tell its story is relevant. And he said that the Russian finally had to give up, and so they found a spot that was near a road, and two big black cars arrived, and he got into the two big black cars, and that was the last he ever saw of him. And he tried to find him, and he was just, the embassy never heard of him. I mean, so he was disappeared because he had publicly humiliated the Soviet Union by losing this race, which my uncle didn't even know was going on. And so he told me that story when I was like about an 8th grader or something. It stuck with me. It's a good story. Well, then the Russians invaded Crimea after we had let them, cross the red line in Syria, and after we'd let them take, part of Georgia, and after we let them take Chechnya. I mean, we've been really, what's the right word, feckless, cowardly. I mean, it's been really bad. And when they took Crimea, I started just feeling, my God, this is coming again. And if we don't help Ukraine, it's going to be Finland all over again. And so then I started thinking, well, time to write a book. And I was always told, or I should say I read, because I never went to any classes, but, if you're going to try to write, never write anything didactically. So I'm hoping that none of this was too much on the nose. But that's what sort of inspired me to do it. And, I came up with, the other thing I was just talking to Richard is that, Deep River's big. And so I said, couldn't get any reviews. So I said, well, this time, damn it, I'm going to write a little book. I'm going to write a movie script. And my wife read the first draft, which was like about 45,000 words. And she just came in, she puts the manuscript down on my desk. She says, get over yourself. Write a novel. So I actually, it's about 3 times longer than it was when it started. But, which reminds me, I love this story, because Deep River, it was big when the first draft was big, 350,000 words. I mean, wow, that's big. And I made the deadline, I had a deadline with Grove and sent it off, very proud of myself. And not a word came back. Nothing. 3 weeks went by, a month, 2 months went by. I was sorry, should I call him on the phone? And, after 10 weeks, Morgan Ingerton, who's my editor, and he's also the CEO of Grove, sent me a 6-word email. Great stuff, too much of it. So I said, well, Morgan, how much should I said 2 things. What I said, well, Morgan, it's only 350,000 words. Anna Karenina is 351,000. And there was this long pause. He says, Karl, I could never sell Anna Karenina today. So I said, cut it in half. And I thought, no, anyway, I cut it a lot. And there's whole sort of chapters and stories and stuff someplace on my computer. So I thought I'd read a couple passages here, and then we'll just open it up for Q&A. To set the scene a little bit, Louise is from Oklahoma, and she is almost an allegory for American naivete. And I spent a lot of time overseas, and I was constantly and still am constantly appalled at how ignorant Americans are, not only about other countries, but about the privileges that they have here, like rule of law. I mean, I was in Kashmir and in Srinagar, and Kashmir is 96% Muslim, and they desperately don't like the Indians, and even now with the current Indian political party, they don't like Muslims, and that tension was just really, really ramped up when I was there. And a guy had come back from the Hajj and had been all amped up about, Allah and the Shiites, and they're sort of, and they could get pretty crazy. And so a riot started, and I'm living with a Sikh family, with my family. I had, at that point, 2 kids. And so we put our family under the big, heavy kitchen table, and we put them under the kitchen table, so when the rocks and stuff coming through the windows, it wouldn't hit them. And we went out on the front porch, and all we had was sticks. I'm sitting there with my stick, and I'm going, this is crazy, cars going up in flame, people throwing them over, screaming. And I turned to my friend and I said, where are the police? And he looked at me like I was from Mars. And he said, Karl, the police are Muslims. Oh, that was the first time it hit me that I had just lived in this world where basically the police were on your side. Now, I know we've got a history where they weren't, but it hit me. I mean, I was that naive. And Louise is a classic. She's president of her sorority and intelligent and go-get-em and a big heart, but really doesn't know much at all about anything east of the Mississippi River. And so she kind of fills in a little bit for that. But I hope I know she's not a caricature, but some reviewer said, oh, I can't believe that woman is so naive. And I wanted to write this. I never respond to critiques. I want to say, you're so naive, you don't know how naive we can be. Because we don't, I mean, we are just incredibly that way. You know. And we're still doing it, if I can make a political statement. We're about to trash Ukraine without giving them weapons, and they have no ammunition left. They're hanging on by their fingernails. And it's costing us, I think, 3 or 4% of our budget. You know, I mean, huh? And not only that, but I do know, because I have connections, the stuff we're giving them is almost all of the stuff that we were going to mothball. Mm-hmm. It's not even their modern weapons, but we don't do it. We've stopped because of a made-up border problem. And, okay, get you later. Arnie and Louise, childless. Louise wants to have children, but she's had several miscarriages, and she's just yearning for children. And Arnie is, of course, trying to do a good job. He's a career military officer. And they are invited to the Russian embassy on a New Year's Eve party. And it's their first month in Helsinki on the job, and they're still a little bit, unsure of themselves. I'm going to read a couple of scenes from this party that kind of sets up the story a bit and gives you an idea of who they are. Arnie and Louise watched the crowd with forced smiles. I hate this, Arnie said, not breaking his smile. I never really liked it either, even though in college I did it all the time. Yeah, but you were good at it. Yeah, sure, in Oklahoma. But I knew what I was doing. I mean, everyone else was from Oklahoma, too. Well, at least you got some training. Socializing wasn't in the West Point curriculum. You should have been a Delta Gamma professor of sorority. You wouldn't let me in, Louise laughed, then looking around said, almost to herself, Arnie, look at that couple over there, the Russian uniform. They're about our age. Arnie looked at the woman first. She was striking, tall, elegantly thin with long, lustrous black hair, and she carried herself like a dancer, fitting one of the two stereotypes with which most Americans viewed Russian women. They were either hardened road workers in shapeless dresses and scarves, or they danced at the Bolshoi. She had almond-colored eyes like creamed coffee. Arnie shifted his gaze to the man he presumed was her husband. Red Army, a polkovnik, the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel, his equal, lots of medals, including the big one, the hero of the Soviet Union, their Medal of Honor. If typical, this man had been at war continuously for 7 years. He looked at the man's face and took in a short breath. What? Louise asked. She's not that gorgeous. No, Arnie replied. He pulled her a little closer. I know that man. You what? How? I'm trying to remember. Then it all came back. May 8th, 1945, just outside of Linz, Austria. Arnie's 71st Infantry Division had just reached the Enns River, and Arnie had been driving a Jeep, his M2 carbine on the passenger seat, Sergeant McCormick in the back with a Browning automatic rifle. They'd been looking for a way to cross the Enns. They'd also been looking for the first signs of their Soviet allies. Linking up with the Russians would be proof that the Germans were now surrounded with total surrender or annihilation, their only choice. McCormick shouted, pointing across the river. Soldiers, perhaps an infantry company in size, at first there'd been the fear, scrambling to get the Jeep between them and the soldiers across the river, the quick calculations, coming so fast it hardly seemed like calculating, chambering rounds, bobbing up for a quick look, back down, bobbing up again. The soldiers on the other side of the river were standing still, looking at them, not throwing themselves on the ground, not scrambling for firing positions. Then he and Mac looked at each other, both with mouths slightly open. They rose slowly. They were looking across the river at the famed Red Army. He remembered their boots, no laces, straight up above the calves, trousers tucked in, belted, quilted overcoats. Oddly to him, the soldiers had a curious lack of steel helmets. Most were wearing light wool garrison caps, the kind that could be folded flat when not in use. But about a third were still in their winter caps of fur with the ear flaps tied together above the crown. A man in a greatcoat stood up on the passenger seat outside of the Lend-Lease American Jeep and raised a Spade and Burt gun above his head, easily identified by the round magazine that made it look like an American Tommy gun. As with American combat troops, officers looked identical to everyone else, but he could tell by the assumed authority that this man was the group's leader. Arnie came out from behind the Jeep, his carbine raised above his head. Then the man with the Spade opened fire into the air, and Arnie ducked and McCormick hit the ground, but the Russian soldiers began shouting, cheering, and pounding each other on the back, some also firing rounds into the air, many waving their arms. The man who fired the Spade was gesturing downstream, spreading one arm wide and back to join the other forearm, and Arnie pumped his carbine up and down to acknowledge he understood. Mac, I think there's a bridge. Arnie always remembered that moment as the moment he declared personal victory over Germany. He also remembered it as the last day of good feelings between the soldiers of the East and the West. Now, the Red Army controlled Eastern Europe from the Adriatic to the Baltic, and it didn't look to Arnie like they would be leaving anytime soon, not without a fight. A couple comments about that. I was 7 years old, and when Stalin died, and most people find this kind of hard to believe, but the headline on the local paper said, "Uncle Joe dies." Uncle Joe. We saw Joseph Stalin in that northwest corner of Oregon as our ally and our good guy friend who helped us whoop the Germans, even in the early 50s. Yeah, Uncle Joe. And again, it's that American naivete. I mean, you know, it's like, well, they helped us beat the Germans, right? Yeah, they did. They killed 20 million of his own people doing it, but no problem. But we didn't know that. I mean, it was known, but for some reason, Americans just didn't tune into it. And so it was that way. And the other thing was I was in India, and I was working in India, and there was a Russian arms dealer who I was, pal around with. And he, one day, he pulled his sleeve up and showed me his wristwatch. And it was a Bulova wristwatch. And I said, wow, this is an American wristwatch. He said, yeah. He said, I met the American Army in Germany, and this lieutenant from the American Army took it off his wrist and gave it to me, and I've carried it ever since. And what's poignant about that is at the soldiers' level, they really did help each other. They really did want to meet each other. They were so happy when they gave, what am I going to do? I'll give you my wristwatch, because they just had to show some kind of gratitude, and especially they knew that the Russians took enormous casualties fighting the Germans. I think people in America don't know, but I think like 80% or more of the Russian divisions were facing Russia. We only faced 20% of their divisions. And it's like, you think we won the war all by ourselves. We didn't. And I have to give the Russian army credit. They absorbed all the heat, and not all of it, but a massive amount of it. We gave them a lot of stuff, Lend-Lease Jeeps, airplanes, and but again, that's part of the history that is forgotten. The next phase, because it's a little more brief, but it does talk about, people, well, what difference does it make, if Putin's in charge or anybody, it doesn't make much difference. The two of them, Arnie and Louise, had started to talk with Natalya and Mikhail, and the two men were drinking a lot and getting on, and as Louise has said that they cook up this race, but the two women are sort of, circling each other a little bit. They kind of like each other, but they're, from very different parts of the world, with very different experiences. Natalya had gone through the siege of Leningrad, and where they literally ate rats, and Louise was in Oklahoma, doing victory gardens. Just again, this thing about how we, the civilian side of World War II, hardly were touched by it, other than that your own family member was killed or hurt. So they're sort of talking to each other, and Natalya was just about to ask Louise a question, and Louise was thankful Natalya didn't ask it. This was because even if Natalya had thought that she would ask the question, she was stopped by the room going quiet. Louise followed the gaze of those around her to the three men entering the large room from an interior open door. Two of the men, large, well-built, flanked the third, a man in his mid-40s with a receding hairline, wearing rimless pince nez glasses. He wore the uniform of a marshal of the Soviet Union. But for the military uniform, the man looked to Louise like a college professor or a librarian. She glanced at Natalya, who had visibly stiffened. Natalya's eyes were darting ever so slightly, as if looking for somewhere to escape. It hit Louise that they were eyes that had seen much more sorrow, and not just at Leningrad. The man raised his hand in a gesture both of hello and carry on, and the buzz in the room slowly restarted. Louise watched Alexander Abramov, that's the Russian ambassador, and his wife scurry to meet the man from the far side of the room, followed in a bit statelier manner by Sokolov, the MGB guy who was sort of the antagonist. Who's that? Louise asked Natalya. Laurent Beria, Natalya said quietly, head of the MGB. Oh, Louise had heard the name. One of the waitresses was hurrying over to the three men with drinks. They took them. Beria raised his in a greeting to the young woman, smiling. She smiled back a little awkwardly, and almost bowing, quickly backed away. Beria turned to one of the flanking men, said something, and they both laughed. Then Beria engaged in conversation with Abramov and Sokolov, while Abramov's wife looked on a bit nervously with a smile that showed no pleasure. Louise looked to Arnie for a clue. He caught her eye and cocked his head just slightly, shaking very discreetly. Beria raised his glass again, indicating that the conversation with Abramov was over. He slowly made his way through the crowd, pausing to make a comment to an acquaintance or two. The two bodyguards followed. They were nearing Louise and Natalya moved in much closer to Louise. She started talking animatedly about her love of music in French, and her back turned to the small group, making its way slowly through the crowd. Louise, facing the group, felt like Beria just briefly sized her up, and then moved on to look at others, paying most attention to the young waitresses. The waitresses were clearly avoiding looking at Beria. Louise was trying to stay in the conversation with Natalya, but all the while couldn't help watching Beria's progress through the crowd. She watched him make a slight nod in the direction of the waitress who had initially served them their drinks, and smiling, went to say his farewell to Abramov and his wife. He left the room without the bodyguards. The conversation level rose almost instantly. The two bodyguards were quietly talking with the original waitress. She had a slight but frozen smile on her face. A man escorted her toward a table while whispering something to her. She set down a tray. Louise watched her being walked from the room between the two large men, her entire body awkwardly stiff, and then they were gone. Beria was a known sexual sadist, and he would just pick girls out. And nobody could say anything, including the girl's parents. I mean, it was just like, it was the way it was. Saddam Hussein was the same way. I mean, these guys, and without the rule of law, they could get away with it. And one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that we're doing this to ourselves. We're afraid to talk to other people because maybe their politics are, maybe they're Trumpies, or maybe they're not Trumpies. So we just keep quiet. That's self-censorship. I don't know what pronoun to say. Well, maybe I better just not talk to anybody besides people who I'm really sure of. A woman who was my interpreter when I was in Russia, worked in Russia, 90s, told me when in her childhood in the Soviet Union, at the dinner table, she couldn't tell if her parents were telling her the truth or not. Because the parents were concerned if they said something wrong, and then one of the kids slipped at school, and then the teacher went to the police, they'd be gone. And so she said that there was this sort of fear all the time of saying the wrong thing. So, hello, here we're coming down this trail ourselves. We don't even need Beria and Stalin to do it. We're just doing it to ourselves, and it's dangerous. And I think we've got to wake up to this. You can't run a republic if you're afraid to talk. And we've gotten ourselves in a pickle here. We should be able to just let it hang out. And I can remember, I'm old enough to know that, then we had this general store in Cannon Beach. And literally, I mean, it's a cliche, but on the one side of the door it said Republicans on the bench, and on the other side it said Democrats. And that was it was sort of a joke. Yeah. It was like, oh, yeah, Republicans, Democrats. Yeah, well, I think a balanced budget is right. No, we should borrow the money and help the poor people. And those are, people would just talk about that. It wasn't like, I don't know if I should talk to him. There was none of that. It's called fear. Hello, so that was something that I, writing this novel, that you read, and you sort of get the sense that the way Natalya and Mikhail have to live, they can only whisper when they're right next to each other in their own beds. And certainly that's further away than we are now, but everything starts with small steps. So that's my political statement for the day. Unless there's a
Second
question.
political statement.
So anyway, let's just have some questions. And someone's got to go first, but someone's always got to go first, and no one will think you're the teacher's pet. So you just,
Do you have a favorite flavor of long drink?
Do I have a favorite what?
Flavor of long drink?
I don't know what you're saying. I guess I can't hear it right.
Oh, long drink. I thought that was the Finnish national beverage.
Not that I know of. Yeah. But that could be. I mean, one of the things is that it's really interesting. My Finnish relatives all came over around 1905, 1910, and things change in Finland, and just like they do everywhere. And we had about 5 professors from the University of Helsinki come over to our house and record my grandmother for several days, because she spoke Finnish in a way that isn't spoken anymore. And she had preserved the 19th century version of Finnish. So the drink may be absolutely true, but it wasn't in Astoria, Oregon. They talk about, Finglish, which is, instead of the Finnish word for coffee cake, pulla, they called it biscuity. It just happens. The language is changing. So, yeah, I don't know. But,
no, it's in every bar there.
Yeah. I'll have to go back. We'll go on the boat to Estonia. That's where they really get.
Estonia?
Yeah, the drinking is way cheaper in Estonia than in Helsinki. It's a ferry ride across the Baltic. And I'm not kidding you. You get on that ferry, and it's nothing but drunken pigs. All the way over and all the way back. It's quite hilarious. So if you're there, that's something that the tourist books don't talk about.
So is Finland in NATO now, isn't it?
Yes, Finland joined NATO, and Sweden, I think, finally got to go ahead. We have some NATO members that really, I don't know why they're in NATO. They're really sort of pro-Russian, and they keep hanging it up. Turkey, Hungary.
Right.
But I'll tell you, I saw, it was the Swedish Prime Minister, and he was making a comment to a group of reporters just a few days ago. It was at Davos. And he was angry. He was so angry. He said, we have risked everything antagonizing the Soviet Union, or the Russians, and joining NATO. We have had to make incredible deals with the Turks to go against our ideals. We've done all this, and now you're pulling out. You're stopping the shipment of weapons. He was just like, and I'm going, we do this so often. We did it to the Kurds. We did it to our Vietnamese allies. We did it to our Afghan allies. We just sort of, again, it's this dumbass American sort of, who cares? I don't know what goes on in where they call it 23 square miles surrounded by reality, Washington, D.C. Yeah, so it's, Finland just joined, and Finland is, I have, like the ski race was, that is really well done, because one of my friends is a Finnish Marine ski trooper. He knows everything. He plotted it out. Bless his soul. I give him big acknowledgments. Marcus Press. He knew exactly how many kilometers they could make a day, whether they'd be on a river, whether they'd be going over a ridge. I mean, so that when you read the ski race, it's very accurate. It really is. And what the problem with Finland being in NATO, and I don't know if people are thinking of this, but I think of this all the time because I'm Finn, and Putin's not going to attack NATO. I mean, he's outnumbered and outgunned, but what is he going to do? He's going to probably do an incursion, little green men again, into northern Finland where there isn't anybody. And then what's going to happen is that people go, well, wait a second, really, Article 5? I mean, he invaded Finland, but it's just up there. There's nobody there. I mean, we don't want to go to war over that, do we? I mean, that's what I think is coming. He's not going to say, I'm declaring war against, no dumbbell, but he's going to do that. And now he's going to watch NATO start to crumble. And if we have the wrong president, it'll crumble way too fast. So I'm still worried about it. And so if Ukraine loses, it's going to be even worse. And people will be very encouraged. So write to your congressman.
So when was the switch there? So you've got Finland being dominated by the Soviet Union in your book.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got Finland and NATO.
Yeah, when did it switch over?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it started switching over when the Soviet Union crumbled.
When it fell,
Early
just
90s.
like Eastern Europe
Yeah,
did.
exactly. And
Oh.
people poke their heads up above the ground. And there was no massive army anymore on the borders, and they had enough problems at home that they probably wouldn't invade. So that's where it started to switch. And they had been, I know they've been doing like joint military exercises with us for several decades. So, but they were still afraid to join NATO.
Right.
Because of the Russians getting angry. And finally, I think when the invasion of Ukraine happened, they went, uh-oh, if we get invaded and we don't have the help from the rest of these countries, then we're really screwed.
Right.
So that moved them off the dime. My friend Marcus, he's a career Marine. He said, I asked him once, do you want to join NATO? This was before. He said, no, I don't. How come? He said, because I believe that we should only fight to defend our country, and I don't want to have to go to war if somebody invades Romania. And well, that sentiment is, we got to watch that, and so this Article 5 thing is like, yeah, right, Article 5. Well, no, I really didn't mean it. I didn't sign that. Some guy signed it 40 years ago. It wasn't me. I mean, I'm a little worried.
We have a history of that. Look at World War I and World War II, where we buried our heads in the sand until the last minute.
Oh yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, Roosevelt had a very difficult time in World War II trying to get people to recognize that, Western civilization was at stake, and it was like, they were sort of called isolationists, and there were a lot of Nazis. And Rachel Maddow has a history book out that is terrifying, because we had real, genuine Nazis with kids going to, Nazi summer camps in the late 30s in this country. And pro-Hitler, because he was, doing all the right things. I mean, our country's pretty racist. And a guy like Hitler comes along and it's like, oh, he's on the right side of history, isn't he? So, I mean, no, we're always, Martin Luther King, I wish I could quote it exactly, I'll paraphrase it. He said that these kinds of forces, dictatorship, and sort of forces, he says, you will never beat them. You will never defeat them because it's in our nature. And every generation has to do the fight. Every generation has to do the fight. Otherwise, you will lose, but you'll never win. And I kind of believe that he's right. So it's coming to us now. And next generation, it'll come some other way. It's in our gene pool. Sebastian Younger told me this. He said that, what's her name? Jane, the famous dude that studied chimpanzees.
Goodall.
Goodall. Yeah. She describes, chimpanzees, loving chimpanzees, great. she describes a time there was a threat from, I think it was a lion crime, was close by. And this sort of amorphous group of, people eating, foraging, and she said the whole society suddenly went, boom, the alpha male in the middle, alpha females right around him, other females with the kids all around them, and right outside of them, all the males. The whole society genetically inclined to organize on that leader, because that's the most efficient way to defend yourself. And I think that's what we have to become conscious of, because you can't be sort of like sex. I mean, if you just acted out your fantasies all the time, I think, it would be fun for about a month and then it would fall apart. So we have to be aware of that with our political instincts. If there's a threat, they're coming across the border, we better organize. So I think that between Goodall and Martin Luther King, we've been fired some warning shots.
Could you talk a little bit about your process of writing the book, and in particular maybe the factual research piece, to the extent that factored in?
Questions factual research about writing a book. Good old Wikipedia is a major part of it. And because it'll get you started, it's really good. And then I'll do things like I'll buy the book about, like I've read fiction, finished fiction. I don't read in fiction, but translations. About the time period of the Civil War and things like that, and get a feel for it that way. I have friends that I can ask detailed questions of, like there's a woman who is the head of the American Finnish Society, and she grew up in Finland, and I go like, well, do you think they'd shake hands or not? No, they wouldn't. Not in those days. They wouldn't shake hands. So, and that's just direct. I just have to ask the question. And the same goes for like skiing. I just asked Marcus, do you think he'd crawl in a hole here? He said, well, yeah, he probably would, but he'd probably try to get his clothes off because he'd be wet from the sweat, so we're going to have to figure out some way of getting that dry before. And so those are not found in text, but I have, and I did the same thing with Deep River. I have one friend, she's just an expert in historical clothing. And so if I had a question, what were the skirt lengths in 1920? Get it up, just call her on the phone, And if she's wrong, I'll just say it was her, wasn't it? And so that's the way I work. And the other thing I learned, a sort of trick, is at some point you can just read background until you're blue in the face and the book never gets written. Because I find it interesting, I have to do it for my writing. What I found is write, and then I go like, I need a detail or two in this passage, and I need detail. What do I need detail about? Skirt lengths. Okay, now I know where to go. So I tend to try to get my research focused on what I've already written in the book. Otherwise, you just sort of, you can go for years and become an expert on Finnish, skiing. Not really much good.
Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the books the Great War books, either influenced you or just that you love.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the war books that I've loved and that I think influenced me. I was very influenced by the World War I poets, Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Rosencrantz, Robert Graves. They were the first people to really shatter the myth of it was all just king and country and glory, and they what was Wilfred Owen's poem? If you knew how horrible war was, I'm paraphrasing that, you would not say to some children seeking a desperate glory, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It means it's sweet to die for your country. If you knew, you wouldn't say that. And so very important. Another book that is not really well known is called In Parentheses by a guy named David Jones. It was written in the 30s. And he's Welsh, and there's a lot of Welsh mythology in it. But the title comes from that he had his life, as everybody does, like 4 years, in parentheses, and then life goes on. And this book in parentheses is available. I don't know if it's sold anymore, but that's a good one.
What's his name again?
Jones.
Did you say David?
Huh?
Did you say David?
Jones. Yeah, David Jones. You can't get more Welsh than that one. Yeah. Another one, I liked The Naked and the Dead. Mailer's book was great. I like James Jones. Is that Jake Jones? Yeah, the Thin Red Line and From Here to Eternity. I thought those were good war books. I liked Going After Cacciato, Tim O'Brien. I always recommend that. I think it's the best of his war books. So I was laughing because Tim and I know each other. And one day we were working on the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam, and I said, God, Tim, I said, you sell a book every year to every 8th grader in America called The Things They Carried. And he looked at me and he said, yeah. He said, there's no English teacher in the world that would assign a book as fat as yours. But so, let me think if there's any other. Oh, oh God. You see, I'm getting to that age where the books go right out of my head. But I thought the Civil War book by the guy that never was at the war.
Shelby
Cook. Yeah. And those are great. Let me think if there's any others that were very meaningful to me. Again, Sassoon, Diary Infantry Officer, I think it's called. Oh, and the Sword of Honor trilogy by this English writer. Sword of Honor trilogy. Come on, Carl, come up with it. I should have known. It's not even. I was getting the question. What?
Griffin?
No. He's very. He wrote Brideshead Revisited.
Oh, okay.
Evelyn Waugh.
Yeah, Waugh. Yeah, that's a great trilogy. It's about his war experiences, which weren't really honorable, but they're fun. He's really very funny. But it gives you an idea of the absurdity of it. And Catch-22 was a great war book. So anyway, that's the line of history.
And we touched on this a little bit earlier today, but the films, the ones that you think really evoke the Vietnam War, or any great war films that you can think of would be.
One of the things that is difficult for writers or filmmakers about war is if you want to be real about it, there's just an awful lot of dead time. I mean, you go there and you sit around and wait, being scared, and you wait, you go on patrols and you're scared, and you come back, but nothing happens. And a movie based on that not going to sell very much. And so people have got to try and work it around to get more real. They have to almost make it boring. It's really a difficult artistic issue. And they can fall into just crazy, stupid stuff. Like I really did not like Apocalypse Now. I thought it was so false. And Americans, again, being dumb and naive, have no idea about the military. Oh, I'll tell you this story. I told you this story last night. I'm at a reading, and this woman comes up and took a book signing on Matterhorn, and she's sort of doing this. What's the matter? I said, what's going on? She said, I'm a little embarrassed that I was in college during the Vietnam War, and I just hated it. And I protested every chance I could. I went to all the rallies. I went to all the protests. And now I've read Matterhorn. I didn't know you slept outside. Yeah. Do you think I'm onto American naivety? Yeah. I was so stunned. Don't be kind. I mean, she didn't know. She had no clue. She had no clue.
She needs to have brothers in the military.
Oh, yeah.
My brothers and my ex-husband and my current son serve.
Yeah. Well, you're rare. Yeah. What were we on there? What was it? Movies, right. Yeah. So Apocalypse Now, the ride of the Valkyries and people in cowboy hats, and it's just bullshit. I mean, guys don't go to combat with the sound of Valkyries. They go scared. and they're young. They're 19, they're 18. The average age in my platoon was 18 and 10 months. 18, that's the average age. We had 17-year-olds. There's not much bravado. I mean, they're scared and they do it, and that's what's wonderful about them. They'll do it, and so movies like that, I just cringe because Americans are so dumb that they think, oh, gee, in Vietnam they went to war in cowboy hats. How about that? You know, with loudspeakers and Wagner. I mean, Wagner's a great tune to go to war on. You know, what was it? I thought Platoon was pretty good. Every sort of scene was pretty accurate. The fact that all that could happen to one guy in 6 months is virtually impossible. But it's a movie, and they strung together a whole bunch of stuff. Same problem I just said. You got to have excitement going on, but you know, it just wouldn't have happened that way. But I thought, in general, I know that Dale Dye, who was the Marine advisor to that movie, took the actors out in the jungle for several weeks and had them walk around with packs and rifles and eat crummy food. They had a feeling for what it was like, and so that was a good movie that way. Full Metal Jacket, it exaggerated how bad boot camp would be on somebody. I mean, I kind of went like, a kid that's going to commit suicide like that, why did he join the Marines? You don't get drafted into the Marines. I mean, I think they drafted 150 people in the Vietnam War or something like that. And the way they did it is that they went to the draft lines, and I think they said that anybody above 6 foot tall, you're in the Marines. You know. So basically, no one in my company was drafted. They were all volunteers. And so the odds of getting somebody who's that unstable wanting to be a Marine, I mean, you know, that didn't work. And then when they were over there, I kind of rolled my eyes. There was this woman sniper, you know, up in the tower, and, you know, they're all trying to figure out how to get rid of her. It's terrible, and we're going to kill her. It wouldn't have worked like that. They'd have just got on the radio, called in a jet, and blasted them to pieces. Just get real, you know. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. So those movies, I think. I thought that the first opening of Saving Private Ryan was the best depiction of that terror and how much of it goes on so fast. I mean, when we would get out of the choppers and the gate would go down, you'd have to run out and there'd be people shooting at you. You just have to run out and people are shooting at you. And when I saw Saving Private Ryan and the gate went down on the boat, they hit the boat, and they ran out, and then 3 of them were dead. You know, it's that fast. And they did a great job on that. And then it kind of got Hollywood toward the end. I said, well, it's a story. Tom Hanks firing at a Messerschmitt with his pistol. You know.
So, just one more question. Anybody who has one last question?
What did you think of the Vietnam series by Novak or Kovac and
Lynn Novak? I thought it was really good. But I was in it. So, you know. Where they say, full disclosure, I was in it. Ken Burns is the 30,000 foot guy, and he's really good, and he's a marvelous leader. He's got this crew of mostly 20-somethings who all want to be filmmakers, working for him for nothing, but they're all really good. And Lynn and Sarah Bernstein were the two workhorses on that, and they did a great job. They worked really hard. She told me that they shot 100 minutes of video for every minute of the documentary. So when you see the quality of that, that's because they went out 99 out of 100 minutes, and it took them a lot of work. I thought they did really well on it, and I can tell you the proof of it is because after it came out, my friends who were sort of, you know, on the left wing were saying, this is a ridiculous documentary. All they did is laud the American military, a bunch of jingoistic, chauvinistic nonsense. They were just terrible. They never talked about the plight of the Vietnamese people and Agent Orange. And the people on the right, who were my friends, who complained about the documentary because all they did was extol the virtues of the Communist Party in the North and how wonderful the North Vietnamese people were and how terrible Americans were. It was just, you know, I went, well, they must have gotten it right. Thanks very much.